working. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to share this story with you. And appreciate everybody's bravery to come out in these conditions to be at this beautiful place and to learn a little bit about history. But one of the lessons of history for me is that there were a lot of people that came before us that really valued places like the Grand Canyon, and sometimes they endured a lot harder conditions than we'll ever see. But it tells us something about human spirit and the profound meaning that places like this have had for people down through the past century and more. I'm going to talk about an expedition that came to the Grand Canyon by horseback in 1909, and it involved 3 participants. Arthur R. Townsend was a geologist from New York, and he had had some previous experience in the rough country. He was about 30 years old, but he brought his sister, his young sister. She turned 21 on this trip, Eleanor. And then the guide was John Wetherill, who was my great-grandfather, and there are a lot of stories about him that we won't have time to go into now, but he was a veteran explorer, trader with the Navajo Indians, and a backcountry guide. So apparently the Townsends had engaged him to bring them to the Grand Canyon. And the fortunate thing is we have some marvelous photographs of this trip that really tell the story in a profound way. There are 3 albums of Townsend photographs. The first one is from 1908, and I'm not going to get into that one, but it involved 2 different expeditions. And then 2 albums from 1909, which cover the expedition that we'll be talking about this morning. 400 photos from the 1909 expedition. So these are real treasures. And almost as amazing as the story itself is how these photos came to be preserved. A couple of years ago, I received an email from a man named Michael Roche, and I didn't know him, but he said he had these albums, and some of them had my great-grandfather's name as a caption, and somehow he tracked me down through the internet and wanted to know if I could shed any light on these. The photographer was not identified except by his initials, ART, and the woman, ERT. So I was able to tell him that those were the Townsends, who were credited with being the first tourists to go to Rainbow Bridge in 1909. And that's part of this 1909 expedition that's included in this photograph. So in these albums. So I asked Mr. Roche where he got the albums. He said, I found them at a landfill. And where he lives, which I later found was New York, there's a place people can put things that they think other people might be interested in. But he said at 3 o'clock that afternoon, if nobody had taken them, the bulldozer would have come. So I have to give him a lot of credit for rescuing these and having the sense to research what they were all about. And I think in the future they'll have an important place in the history of this area. The Townsends had a pretty ambitious itinerary. They apparently took the train to Gallup, New Mexico, hired somebody to guide them to Tuba City, Arizona, and they did acquire a wagon, probably for the comfort of Eleanor. But they passed through Ganado and the Hopi mesas, and there's some marvelous photos of those places that I won't show today. In the meantime, John Wetherill was at Rainbow Bridge. This was August 14th, 1909, on the famous Cummings-Douglas expedition that brought the existence of Rainbow Bridge to light and recommended that it be preserved as a national monument. So I can kind of picture John having this deadline to go down and meet the Townsends at Tuba City and be in a big rush to go back to his home at Old Jato, Utah, which is near Monument Valley, re-outfit, and then rush down to Tuba City to meet the Townsends. And I suspect that the original itinerary was maybe Grand Canyon and Monument Valley, Navajo National Monument, but when the Townsends heard about Rainbow Bridge, I'm sure John convinced them it was a fantastic place to see, and they wanted to go there as well. So meeting at Tuba City and getting together, they traveled to a number of different places in the Grand Canyon, and the farthest west they went from the photos, it was Bass Camp and the South Bass Trail. This is a picture of John Wetherill getting ready to cross the Little Colorado River. An example of the types of photos they have. And there he's trying to ford the Little Colorado. It was running pretty high. They made it to Bass Camp, and here's a nice picture of the buildings there. And W.W. Bass's great-granddaughter, Jeannie Valentine, sent me this entry from the Bass Hotel Register. So we know that they were there on September 3rd. This is one of the pictures of a boy that lived at the Bass Camp. I'm hoping somebody here can tell me his name, but apparently he was an expert roper, and Arthur Townsend thought that he should be preserved in film. There was a fairly aggressive schedule for the travelers at the Grand Canyon, and unfortunately we don't have a trip log, but from the captions on the photograph we can see where they went. Bass Camp, down the Bass Trail to what they call the Bass Tramway, over to the Bright Angel Trail, and down the Tramway Trail, which was a predecessor to the modern South Kaibab Trail, the lower section of that, to Yavapai Point, and then down the Grandview Trail to Horseshoe Mesa. And I'll show you some examples of some of the photos. This is going down the Bass Trail, and the camp, a pretty rustic spot there. This is the end of the tramway. Quite an interesting photo. Let's see if I can figure out this laser pointer. Okay. That's John Wetherill there. And if we blew this up, we could identify some of the other people. That might be W.W. Bass, I'm not sure. And you can see the donkey and a lot of things going on. There's the tramway itself going across the river. And coming out. Stopping at a spring. Then they went down the Bright Angel Trail, and those of you that have hiked it will probably recognize this spot. It's obviously Indian Garden. Someday we'll get an exact after picture from the same spot. Looking out the other way, John Wetherill there and Eleanor Townsend there. and Eleanor had the benefit of a tent. They made it down to the foot of what they called the Tramway Trail. This drops off into the inner gorge just east of where the modern South Kaibab Trail does. And if you look at it, there's still remnants of it. You wonder how horses got down there. But they did. And so to put it in place, you can barely see a cable going across, which was the Rust cable crossing over to what's now Phantom Ranch. And that's where the Black Bridge now is. So there's a nice campsite there. And we have made a replica photograph from this exact spot, which was kind of fun. In this photo, there's John Wetherill and Eleanor Townsend. Then there are some photos labeled the Grandview Trail, and this is the copper mine buildings on Horseshoe Mesa as they existed in 1909. A photo labeled the Old Copper Mine Trail, and what I'm pretty sure this is the trail off of Horseshoe Mesa down to Miners Spring, if you're familiar with that. It's incredibly steep, and if you blow it up, these photos have a lot of interesting details in them. There's John Wetherill in kind of a dilemma because there's one horse trying to go up and one horse trying to go down. And you can imagine the challenges they faced in dealing with day-to-day issues like this. From the Grand Canyon, they proceeded up to Navajo National Monument, to the Wetherills' home at Old Jato, Utah, and then to Rainbow Bridge. And then after going to Rainbow Bridge, they came back to Old Jato and went up to Bluff, Utah, and the Townsends continued on to Colorado. So I'll just give you a little taste of what that part of the trip was like. They went to Navajo National Monument. One thing you'll see in these albums is the importance of national monuments and parks for these early visitors. Those were the attractions that particularly interested them. And I think it attests to the importance of having national monuments and parks and the meaning it's had for people down through the past century. They picked up their wagon in Tuba City, and Old Jato was not a place where there were good roads. So they had their challenges getting it there. This caption said, "The only place where Wetherills swore." I swore several other places, ART. So did I, ERT. But they got everything on a steady condition and continued on. That's Agathla, or El Capitan, near Monument Valley. And finally, they arrived at the Wetherills' home and trading post at Old Jato. It was really a remote place at that time, and kind of out what seemed the middle of nowhere. But the Wetherills loved living there, and they loved associating with the Navajo Indians and Paiutes that lived around there. Their house was, by all standards, pretty crude, but it was a welcome place for visitors like the Townsends, and the only place like it anywhere in the area. This is the Wetherills' trading partner, Clyde Covell, cutting the hair of John's and Louise's son, Ben. And the girl standing there is Georgia Ida Wetherill, daughter, and known as sister. And she was my grandmother. And Arthur also captured image of some of the Navajo people that were hanging around the trading post. And I'm sure that was an experience in itself to get to know them. But the time came to re-outfit and head to Rainbow Bridge, and this is the three of them. The wagons in the background, they left it at Old Jato because John had just come back from this pioneering expedition, and there was no time to improve any trails, so even on horseback, to get from Old Jato to Rainbow Bridge was quite an endeavor. It was about 70 miles each way over some hard-to-imagine rugged country. So the Townsends came up with names for some of the sections. There's Eleanor there, and a particularly steep place where it was unsafe to stay on your horse. But they reached the bridge, and as far as we know, they were glad to be there, even though they'd gone through extreme difficulty to get there. Now, some of you who have guided other people know the stress and the difficulty and the hassle of doing that. And we also have a photo that shows how John Wetherill coped with that stress. This was taken under Rainbow Bridge, labeled the hopeless inebriate. Actually, John didn't drink, but it just shows to me the good spirit that they had and the level of effort that they would go through to see the Southwest's beautiful places. But I'd really like to give credit to Eleanor. You can imagine a girl 20 years old that she turned 21 on this trip. This photo was from her passport application just a few years later. And we can just speculate on what she learned from the trip, despite the hardships. Here's a New York girl that probably hadn't been camping before and went through all this to see these extremely beautiful places. The profound change it must have made in her life and how she passed on those lessons to her descendants. So to me, that's the value of preserving places like the Grand Canyon and Rainbow Bridge and the other places they went to. And I'd like to show my appreciation for the Park Service and other people who have been involved with suggesting and having the foresight to preserve national monuments and parks. And I think it's had a beneficial effect on the larger society to have places like that, and we can probably tell our own stories of what it's meant to us. Thank you.